Hey everybody, I want to continue our conversation about quantitative research designs, and in this video I want to talk about the survey design, which is by far the most commonly used quantitative research design. And primarily this is because it is very easy to collect large amounts of data from a lot of different subjects to answer questions about what's going on in a certain environment or context. So remember, the purpose of descriptive or survey, it's sometimes called survey research, is to generalize to a larger group of people, we call them the population, about some characteristic or attitude or perception or even a belief that this group of people has. So surveys allow us to grab a lot of data and to say some things about what the larger population of people might think. So the advantage of using a survey is that they're very easy to design. It just, as we'll talk about here in a few slides, as long as you can develop good questions that get at the types of characteristics and opinions and beliefs that you want to ask about, as long as you can ask clear questions, then you can expect good, valid responses using surveys. And then also you get a rapid response from your subjects. So rather than taking people into a lab and collecting, let's say, saliva or blood or even some performance measurement where it takes a lot of time to schedule with them and get them in the lab, surveys are easy to hand out to a lot of people, a room full of people, or even at the end of a sport event. Let's say you go to Angel Stadium and you're outside the stadium and you want to hand out hundreds of surveys. You can rapidly hand them out and give them back from people, even if, let's say, you have a phone and they can just take it on the phone very quickly. Rapid response, rapid data collection makes it an obvious choice for people who, for whom time is of the essence, and if you want to collect a lot of quick data. So most often we collect this large amount of descriptive data through questionnaires. Most surveys involve questionnaire type data collection, where it's typically in this form of written sentences where you make a statement and you have the subject or the participant give their response and circle a response, let's say from 0 to 5 or 1 to 7, whatever it is. And often these are, the technical name is called Likert-based questions, L-I-K-E-R-T. That's just the name of the guy, the statistician who originally came up with the idea. But you'll ask basic statements, and then you'll have people circle their response to it, or their feeling, or their belief related to it. But you can also collect survey data through interviews. It's sometimes those annoying calls that you get, the spam messages on the phone, that if somebody hooks you, suddenly you're participating in a survey, whether you wanted to or not, right? So those are becoming less and less often, but this is still an example. Let's say even some of you might want to do survey research, and you might want to engage in interviews where you collect numeric responses. You have people choose a response in terms of a number, and maybe you even use FaceTime or some Zoom platform in order to get numeric data as well as qualitative data. So surveys can also be used in a mixed methods design where you're trying to get both quantitative and qualitative data. And then you can also do an observation type research. Remember for the examples you did in class where you watched a sporting event, many of you found yourself probably checking a box every time a behavior occurred. So you see how easily those observations could be turned into numbers and frequencies and percentages of time that a certain behavior happened. And so survey research can also involve interviews and observations, and not just questionnaires. But questionnaires are what we commonly think of when we consider survey research. So here's a quick slide as to what the advantages and disadvantages of the survey process are. Remember, as you're designing your survey, though, for those who are going to do survey research, or there are some drawbacks. The questions that we ask aren't always as clear and valid as we might think. So we'll talk later in class about the need to make sure that your questions are actually valid, that they measure what they are supposed to measure about whatever variable or characteristic that you want to study. There's also a lack of control. We can't make people complete the survey. Yeah? If they choose or they check out after 25 items and your survey is 30, technically you're not supposed to use that survey, and we can't make them do it. Participants can always have the right to refuse and to get bored and to check out. So you always run that risk, and the longer your survey is, the more likely that people will check out and stop taking it. So survey length is a real consideration when you're building your questionnaire. And my inability to probe, remember in qualitative research you could follow up someone's response to get more clarification or to pursue a deeper understanding of the information, whereas with a questionnaire you have more simple responses to basic statements, and so sometimes the level of information that you can get is less. And then we always are faced with this, well, not always, but usually, if you give out the survey to 200 people, you'll be very fortunate if more than 40% of the people respond. So normally anything above like a 40% response rate in questionnaire-based research is considered very good. You're looking at an overview of the questionnaire design process. Most of you, I will say over and over again, most of you should choose to use someone else's questionnaire. As you're reading articles for your literature review and as you're writing up your introduction, you will notice surveys that have been used in previous studies. If you can use one of their surveys, this will save you a lot of time and effort in terms of validating and making sure that the survey actually gets at the type of information that you need. So I will say it now and again, please try to find a survey that someone else has created that is being used in current research and that can measure the same type of thing that you want to measure for your study. But if you decide to design your own questionnaire, obviously, well, even if I don't decide to design my own, I need to make sure that the survey that I use actually gives me the information that I need. And so step number one is I need to identify what are the objectives of my actual research? What is the purpose? And will this survey actually give me the data that can address that purpose and that can answer my research question? And will it give me the level of data that I need to answer it well? For example, if I want to compare responses on a questionnaire based on varsity athletes versus, let's say, junior varsity or freshman, sophomore type athletes, will the data allow me to actually compare group scores in a meaningful way? And can I take averages of the scores? Can I actually do more sophisticated statistical measurements? So once I decide on what are my characteristics or variables that I'm actually taking a look at, and what is my specific research question, then I can start to make a final decision on whether I can use a survey from the research, from previous studies, or if I need to build my own. And if I build my own, then the next step is to determine the layout of question types that I need. Remember, like qualitative research, the data that I get is only as good as the questions I ask. So there are different types of questions that you can include on a survey designed to get different levels of information and even designed to have participants clarify their opinions and their beliefs about the variable, that you are interested in. And once I've developed all my questions, then I need to pilot it. I need to practice the survey. I need to collect some data from a small group of participants. And then I need to evaluate the reliability and the validity of the questions that I ask in order to make sure that the survey is good. And we'll talk later on in class about how you can do that. And especially for those of you who will use a questionnaire to collect data for your project, we will spend more time on this evaluation process. Kind of a quick word of caution here, though. It's really important that each of you clearly understands your research question and your specific variables that you want to collect data on. Because it's really tempting to just sort of throw out a survey, and like this quote says, often I use a survey based on insufficient design and planning in order to gather a bunch of facts, right? Let's say I want to know what Division I elite athletes in whatever sport feel about, the current police violence and social unrest in America in 2020. I don't just throw out a survey to collect as much information about that big topic as possible. It's not just a fact-gathering exercise. I have to clarify, what do I mean about the social environment and the racial injustice? And, on one side, I have to clarify, what about that racial injustice do I need to understand better? I don't just throw out the survey net to try and drag in a bunch of information. I read more articles. I clarify, what about racial justice in a sport context do I want to know? And then on the other side, from whom? What type of athlete? What sport? And then other variables that I think might actually impact their perception of racial justice and the current social environment. So in other words, I don't just throw out a survey and then bring in a bunch of data and then try to make sense of it. I go in with a specific focused research question, and then I use the survey to collect specific data that's much easier to work with and that's much more effective in answering my more specific question. All right, so a couple slides about how to design questions and just different question types that you can use on your survey. These are a few of the most commonly used questions. Remember, I ask questions in order to get a certain type of data and a certain level of data. Let's start with some of the more simple levels of data. Closed questions or filter questions give us very preliminary, sometimes superficial information, but they force participants to choose between a couple different options because you as the researcher really need them to choose. So a filter question will go all the way to the bottom. Depending on the subject's response, you might kick them to a different version of the survey. So let's say you're comparing people, everything is political right now, so let's say you're comparing different groups based on their politics and who they're going to vote for in the presidential election. So, the first filter question might be, who do you plan to vote for in the 2020 presidential election? And then if they answer Donald Trump, they circle a 1, then they have a different version of the survey, let's say. And if they answer Joe Biden, then they go to another version of the survey. So filter questions help you direct respondents based on a specific given answer that they might choose because you want to direct them that way. Closed questions, this first option, force participants to answer the question related to a particular pre-coded response. So for example, if I'm interested in knowing how many people engage in different levels of intensity of physical activity, and I want to compare, moderate intensity versus low intensity in terms of health benefits, then my first question might be, do you engage in moderate intensity physical activity? And then I force them into choosing how many times per week because I really want to start separating or comparing groups based on how many times per week they exercise moderately with a moderate level of intensity. So the point is, I use pre-coded questions when I want to compare groups on a particular response to a question. And I would ask this type of question, of course, because it makes it easy to analyze differences, in this case, between those who exercise multiple times per week at a moderate level of intensity versus those who might not exercise at a moderate intensity at all. But there's some problems here. I have to be very clear about my options, my answer options. Otherwise, I can confuse people and get bad data. Yeah, for example, if I'm trying to separate groups of people based on the age, how old are you, is the question, and that I don't clearly define the difference between those who are 11 to 20 and those who are 20 to 30, notice here, if I'm 30 or 20, I could click 2 boxes. Lame example, but even more lame if you actually ask this and then you have to sort through the data and it's confusing, yeah? So obviously it would be 11 to 19 and 20 to 29, or 11 to 20 and 21 to 30. You decide, but be careful. The second type of question design is a more open-ended. It's not a qualitative type question, but it's more qualitative than the coded response, yeah? So anytime we want people to be able to give their own response or even to elaborate based on a more specific question, we might input an open question, okay? So that then instead of forcing them into boxes related to moderate physical activity once a week, twice a week, 3 times a week, we might just leave an open-ended response because we want to hear from them and we don't want to force them into categories. If you want to force them into categories, a closed question does this a lot better. If you don't, use an open-ended or even a combination as we just talked about. I might ask a more specific question and try and force them into 2 options, but if I think there might be more than 2 options and I want to leave it open for them to tell me something else, then I would add an open-ended response at the end of the question. Okay? Still another option here. Often we want people to rank things. We want them to show us their preference, to show us maybe what they are more likely to do, and so we want them to rank different choices according to their opinion and their belief. So let's say I'm a sport marketer trying to get at why people come to the game, or what about the game that they really want to spend money on. Then you could just ask a question like, rank the following in order of interest when deciding to attend a sporting event. Do you pay for the on-the-field action, or do you really, buy a ticket in order to watch the halftime show and the performance? Some people do, right? Or do you go for the concessions? Like my kids, if I want to get them to a game, I gotta promise them food, right? Junk food, the more the better. And so if you want to get me to spend money on your game, maybe you want to know which factors make me more likely to spend money on the game. Is it the on-the-field action, the entertainment, or the concessions? Rank them. If you want to know from people how they really feel, don't just have them check, don't just have them lead them into a choice of one answer or another. Have me rank it, because that's where you see my real priorities come out. All right, the next 3 slides get at probably the most commonly used question type in survey or questionnaire-based research, and these are Likert-based scale questions, where you try to measure the extent of agreement or even the strength of a feeling or an attitude related to a statement. So often you make a numeric score related to the extent of agreement in this case. So the question here is, sport is the most important thing in my life, and then you get to decide if you strongly disagree with it, or very much disagree, or strongly or very much agree, or if you're kind of meh, in the middle, neutral, right? We always give people this option of, I don't know how I feel, I'm undecided or indecisive. And we do this because we can really, there's a measurable difference between a 1 and a 4, or a 2 and a 5. And we can take averages, and if we measure this among 75 people of different genders and different socioeconomic status and different athletic backgrounds, whatever our sample is, then you see that we can really start to get meaningful statistical comparisons. So Likert scale questions are really good at generating numeric scores that can be compared. And so obviously we can ask these extent of agreement scale type questions related to words, related to feelings, related to attitudes, and here's just some examples that you can go back to later that measure attitudes in your subjects, and how difficult or easy did they feel something was, or whatever your variable is that you want to measure. These are just examples of different ways of providing a numeric score to the strength of people's response to the question, an attitude scale. How much time do you think we spend? So this is a coaching example where you might measure your athletes to say, hey, hours spent in practice. Is it too little? Is it about right? Or is it too much? So you get to decide how many levels or numbers that participants can choose from. Be careful though, the more you get above 5 choices or so, the more confusing it is. For example, if I had a scale of 1 to 8, where 1 is very much agree and an 8 is very much disagree, what really is a 6? You know, or what really is a 3? It can be tough to differentiate if you have too many options. So normally, the typical Likert scale question will have 5 or 6 choices, but not much more than that. All right, so a couple thoughts about actual wording of your questions. Just like qualitative research, I want to use as simple of language as possible in order to communicate the specific things that I want people to respond to. So the wording in the sequence should be simple. It should avoid ambiguity or unclear language whenever possible. We should ask as few questions as possible in order to keep the participant engaged. And I need to always be thinking about what it's like to take the survey. So less is more, be more precise than we think we need to be. And that comes from reading a lot of research and understanding the things that you're asking about in a clear way. Again, like qualitative research, I want to avoid leading questions. Do you agree that because baseball is boring, there should be rule changes? Whoa, I mean, I'm already projecting my bias onto you with that question. Yeah, so a Likert-based scale where I ask you to, I give you a more neutral question, like baseball should take a look at modifying its rules, and then I have you strongly agree or strongly disagree, and I break those questions down, will avoid leading you into my biased thoughts on the matter. Threatening questions where people might perceive that there could be a negative consequence based on their response. So, did you participate in the post-game Lakers riot last night? Maybe you say, yeah, totally, it was great. But maybe you say, I'm not going to be honest because I'm not sure what you're going to do with the information. So obviously we want to avoid silly faults like these, but they can be really common, even in studies where we really care about the information that we're trying to better understand. Avoid complex questions, especially related to theories or previous research that you read. Chaladurai, this fancy name, is just a sport management leadership theorist who developed leadership theories. So if I'm doing a survey on leadership preferences, I wouldn't ask, how well do you think Chaladurai's model of leadership explains your own actions regarding personnel evaluation? What? I don't even understand the question. So be careful on not making your questions too wordy or overly complex. So let's transition away from asking specific questions and now to a topic about how many participants should I have in my study. We're going to save some specific details on that until a discussion in class later on this semester. But for now, remember the whole point of survey research is to collect data on a group of people called a sample that's supposed to relate a larger group of people in the community that we call a population. So let's say if you want to examine Division I athletes in Southern California, men and women, maybe there's a population of, I don't know, 15,000 student athletes in Southern California. That's the population, but I don't have access to every one of them. So I'm trying to collect a sample from a smaller group of people related to that 10,000 or so student athletes. But I want this sample to be as representative as possible. And so often the short answer to how many people should you have taking your survey is as many people as you can get. But there are other ways of making sure that your sample is representative so that whatever data you find you can say that that realistically represents the larger population of, in this case, student athletes in Southern California that you're trying to say something about related to their attitudes and opinions and beliefs from your survey. So remember as well, not only do we want our sample to be as big as possible in order to best accurately and most accurately predict the larger population, but we also want that sample to be representative. Again, back to our surveying of student athletes in Southern California related to anything that we care about. If we're going to understand what student athletes think or what their perceptions are or their preference are, then whatever the characteristics of that population are, they should be reflected in the sample as well. Things like race, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, playing experience, all these things, all these characteristics of the typical person and the population of student athletes in Southern California, we should seek to reflect in our sample. And the best way to do that, as we said last week, was to get a random sample from the larger population. Most often we can't get a perfectly random sample because that would mean giving everybody in that 10 or 15,000 of student athletes in Southern California, we'd have to give them a number and then we have to randomly choose them from the larger population. We don't have the time or the access to these people, right? So we have to do a more systematic or a more strategic way of doing our best to try and get this random sample. And we do that a couple different ways. You choose what your strategy is going to be, but basically you realize that you can't do a perfectly random sample, so you do the next best thing. So the first next best thing could be a systematic random sample. Let's say of the 15,000 of our student athletes in Southern California, we know all the universities where these student athletes play. So we might use the NCAA Blue Book and we might pick every 10th school or university in Southern California, and then we send the survey for student athletes at every 10th school to participate. So it's a systematic way of picking every 10th school essentially in order to try and provide a quick and yet representative sample that mirrors the population. Or, and that's, let's say, if we just can't get to every university, we can pick every 10th or every 5th or whatever it is. You decide, but you systematically sample in that way. Or you could be more specific, and let's say there's a specific characteristic that you can break different groups of the population into. So you might break them into these groups in advance of your survey, and then you might send out the survey according to how they meet this criterion or this characteristic that you've stratified or split your sample into. So to say it simply, let's say of your population of student athletes in Southern California, if you know that 40% are Hispanic and 15% are African American and 35% are white or Caucasian, for example, then you would make sure that those numbers are represented in your sample as well. Yeah? 30, 15, and 45, or whatever I said. You would make sure that whatever percentage you know exists in the population, you would make sure to mirror that percentage in your sample. Or if it's men and women, if you know there's 63% of student athletes in Southern California are women, then you would make sure that 63% of your participants in your sample were women as well. So you get the point. You stratify according to a characteristic that you think is represented in the population, and you make sure, especially if you're looking at gender as one of your primary variables, you want to make sure that your sample accurately represents the population that you want to speak into and say something about. Okay, and there are other ways to engage in practical random sampling as well. I will include this PowerPoint in Blackboard under week 5 under quantitative survey. I think that's the title of the PowerPoint, so that you can look through some of the other slides here. And then remember, in class in the coming weeks, we'll talk about how to get good data, whether you use a survey or an experimental quantitative design. And then we'll even talk, for those of you who use surveys, we'll talk about how to retrieve good surveys from previous studies, or how to build a good survey on your own, or a questionnaire. Those two words are interchangeable, right? Or to build a good questionnaire on your own. So for now, thanks for watching, and I'll see you in class, okay?